03:47 a.m. A sensor cluster 40 kilometers northeast of Mykolaiv picks up acoustic signatures consistent with a Shahed 136 launch sequence. The data reaches Sky Sentinel's fusion layer in under 3 seconds. 90 seconds later, a probabilistic launch corridor map covers 600 square kilometers of Ukrainian airspace. Interceptor drones are already moving to pre-assigned waypoints. Gun teams on the M14 highway adjust their positions before the swarm is even visible on optical sensors. Russia's plan was simple: build 6,000 Geran 2 drones per month at the Alabuga facility in Tatarstan. Launch them in waves of 500 or more per night. Drain Ukrainian Patriot batteries of their PAC-3 interceptors at $4 million per missile. Wait for the magazines to empty, then push through the gap. A $50,000 Shahed against a $4 million PAC-3. Do the math at 500 drones per night, and Russia's accountants thought they had found the formula that breaks Ukrainian air defense. What the formula missed was a software layer called Sky Sentinel, and a $500 cannon modification on a Yak-52 trainer aircraft. That asymmetry is the whole story. Mera 30. Hook resolution tease. Sky Sentinel is not a radar system. It is not a missile battery. It is a data fusion platform, and what it does is invisible until you see the results. The platform stitches together acoustic sensor posts scattered across southern and eastern Ukraine, mobile low probability of intercept radar, passive sensors running on ADS-B-style radio frequency monitoring, and crowdsourced civilian reports flowing through the ePPO mobile application. Alone, each of these sources produces noise, a distant thump that might be artillery, a radar blip that disappears, an ePPO report from a civilian who heard something unusual to the east. Individually, these are fragments. Sky Sentinel's fusion algorithm treats them as correlated data points, and within 90 seconds of the first sensor hit, it generates a probabilistic launch corridor map with confidence intervals assigned to each ingress route. The operational consequence of that 90-second window is what separates this system from a surveillance tool. Ukrainian Air Force forward air controllers are not waiting for individual radar tracks before deciding where to position interceptors. They are pre-positioning assets along predicted Agner corridors before the swarm has crossed the first waypoint. Interceptor drones take off toward assigned grid squares. Yak-52 light aircraft begin their low-altitude hunting patterns along the most probable flight paths. Mobile gun teams on the M14 corridor and the approaches to Odessa reposition to cover the gaps between fixed battery sectors. Patriot and Iris-T batteries receive queuing data and adjust their engagement queues before the first Shahed enters their radar coverage. The kill chain is already set before the threat is visible. What's most surprising about Sky Sentinel isn't the sensor technology. It's that the most consequential input into the system is a civilian with a smartphone. The ePPO application, initially designed to let Ukrainian citizens report suspicious activity, was integrated into the fusion layer in late 2024. By spring 2026, active ePPO contributors numbered in the tens of thousands across the regions most frequently targeted by Shahed swarms. When a launch occurs, the acoustic signature propagates across a wide area. Civilians who recognize the sound, and after 4 years of war, many do, submit reports with location and bearing. Sky Sentinel's algorithm cross-references these against sensor data in real time, refining its corridor prediction with each additional input. A system that cost millions to build is being continuously improved by people who pay nothing to contribute. Bar retention, Kotchant point. The Alabuga production line had been running at scaled capacity since mid-2002. 5. Independent analysts tracking satellite imagery of the Tatarstan facility confirmed the expansion through multiple open-source assessments, published between October 2025 and February 2026. The Geran 2, Russia's domestically branded version of the Iranian Shahed 136, was being produced at a rate that made individual interception increasingly expensive for Ukraine's highest-tier systems. Russian operational planning reflected this arithmetic. Swarm sizes increased through the winter of 2025 to 2026. The October through December 2025 period saw consistent nightly launches exceeding 300 drones, and by March 2026, Ukrainian Air Force reporting indicated multiple nights where the inbound exceeded 500. The Russian logic was coherent on paper. Patriot's PAC-3 missiles are precision interceptors designed primarily for ballistic and cruise missile threats. Using them against a $50,000 drone is economically unsustainable at scale. Ukrainian officials acknowledged as much publicly. The goal of Russian swarm doctrine was not to guarantee every drone reached its target. It was to force Ukraine to choose between expending expensive interceptors or absorbing hits. Run the attrition long enough, and the PAC-3 magazines run dry. That was the theory. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Ukraine's Patriot expenditure on Shahed-class targets fell sharply through the spring of 2026, even as swarm sizes reached their peak. The interception rate did not fall with it. According to Ukrainian Air Force daily summaries, tracked by independent OSINT analysts from April through May 2026, neutralization rates in defended corridors climbed into the high 80s%. More drones were being stopped. Fewer expensive missiles were being used to stop them. Those two trends should not coexist, unless something structural had changed in how the intercept layer was organized. Sky Sentinel changed the layer below Patriot. That is the answer. Retention point 4. 00 stakes bend. Consider what a Shahed swarm looks like from the perspective of a Patriot battery crew without fusion data. Dozens of low-signature targets approaching at varying altitudes between 50 and 200 meters, some flying programmed evasion patterns, others maintaining straight-line courses to saturate the radar picture. The battery must discriminate between targets, prioritize the highest value threats, and manage its interceptor inventory against a dynamic inbound count. Every PAC-3 fired at a Shahed is a missile that cannot be used against a ballistic missile or a cruise missile traveling at twice the speed. Battery commanders are making inventory decisions in real time under saturation pressure. Russian planners understood this and designed their swarms to exploit it. Sky Sentinel restructured that pressure by moving the engagement decision upstream. If the fusion platform correctly predicts ingress corridors with 90-second lead time, Patriot batteries are no longer the first line of response. They are the last line, reserved for targets that penetrate the lower layers. The lower layers, interceptor drones, Yak-52 aircraft, mobile gun systems, handle the bulk of the swarm along predicted routes. What reaches Patriot's radar coverage is a degraded remnant of the original inbound count, and those are the targets the battery engages with its precision interceptors. The Yak-52 contribution to this architecture deserves attention because it is a genuinely creative piece of Ukrainian adaptation. The Yak-52 is a Soviet-era piston-engine trainer aircraft. It was designed in the 1970s to teach student pilots basic airmanship. Its cruise speed is roughly 300 kilometers per hour. It carries no weapons in its original configuration, costs roughly $40,000 to $60, 000 to operate per flight hour, and does not appear in any conventional Air Force threat assessment for a high-intensity conflict. Ukrainian engineers looked at the Shahed 136's flight profile, subsonic, low altitude, programmed course, radar cross-section roughly equivalent to a large bird, and concluded that the Yak-52, modified with a cannon system, could intercept it with high reliability at a fraction of the cost of any missile system. Put yourself in the position of a Ukrainian Air Force planner in early 2025, staring at the Patriot expenditure rate and the Alabuga production numbers. The missile budget is finite. The drone production rate is not. You need an interceptor that costs less than the target. The Yak-52 cannon modification costs roughly $500 per intercept in ammunition, against a $50, 000 Shahed. The cost-exchange ratio finally favors the defender. The only requirement is knowing where the drone will be with enough lead time to position the aircraft. Sky Sentinel provides that lead time, bar retention count point, 10-min microfinal. The first coordinated Yak-52 intercept operations under Sky Sentinel queuing were documented by OSINT analysts in late 2025, cross-referencing Ukrainian Air Force, reporting with geolocated debris fields and flight track data from amateur radio frequency monitoring. The pattern was consistent. Yak-52 aircraft operating in pairs, pre-positioned along corridors identified by the fusion platform, intercepting Shaheds at altitudes between 70 and 150 meters, using forward-firing cannon systems. The aircraft were operating at night, using passive navigation, without emitting radar signals that would alert Russian electronic intelligence assets to their position. From the ground, defenders might hear a distant burst of cannon fire before the drone fell. Russian planners reviewing their own damage assessments saw a different picture. Swarms that launched with 500 units were arriving at their targets with fewer than 80. One obstacle the system faced in its early operational period was atmospheric interference with acoustic sensors during winter. Sustained low temperatures across southern Ukraine in November and December 2025 affected the propagation characteristics of acoustic signatures, reducing the detection range of individual sensor nodes and increasing false positive rates in the fusion algorithm. Sky Sentinel's engineering team responded by adjusting the algorithm's confidence thresholds and increasing cross-reference weighting toward the ePPO civilian network during periods of degraded acoustic performance. The system adapted to the weather. Intercept rates dipped slightly in December 2025, then recovered as the calibration was refined. The ePPO integration also ran into data quality problems early on. Civilian reports submitted during the first months of the fusion experiment included a significant percentage of false positives. Reports triggered by artillery, industrial noise, or misidentification of other aircraft. The algorithm required training data to distinguish actionable reports from noise. Ukrainian Air Force technicians spent months calibrating the civilian input layer against confirmed sensor detections, building a weighting system that assigned higher confidence to reports from contributors with consistent accuracy histories. By spring 2026, the civilian input layer was contributing meaningfully to corridor predictions on nights when sensor coverage was degraded by jamming or weather. Here's what this tells us about modern air defense. The most effective systems are not necessarily the most expensive ones. Sky Sentinel's advantage is not in any individual sensor. It is in the architecture that connects cheap sensors to cheap interceptors through a fast data layer. The expensive systems, Patriot Iris-T, become more effective because they are used less, reserved for threats the lower layers cannot handle. Retention conch point. 50% mid-roll hook. Russia's response to declining swarm effectiveness through the spring of 2026 followed a predictable pattern. Russian mill bloggers writing on Telegram channels covering the air campaign acknowledged the interception problem as early as February 2026, framing it initially as Ukrainian lucky shots, before the consistency of the pattern became impossible to explain away. By April 2026, discussion in Russian military-adjacent online spaces had shifted to whether launch patterns needed to change. Reports filtered through OSINT analysis suggested that Russian planners began experimenting with more varied launch corridors, shorter time intervals between successive waves, and increased uses of decoy drones designed to trigger Sky Sentinel's sensor network and exhaust interceptor positioning resources before the main swarm arrived. The decoy approach was a genuine tactical problem for the Fusion platform. If Russia could saturate the acoustic sensor network with low-cost decoy launches that mimicked Shahed acoustic signatures, Sky Sentinel's probabilistic mapping would face a signal-to-noise problem. Corridor predictions would become less reliable. Interceptors positioned along predicted routes might be covering the wrong areas when the real swarm arrived. Ukrainian Air Force technical personnel acknowledged this challenge indirectly in public statements that noted ongoing algorithm refinement without specifying the nature of the adaptations. The Fusion platform was in a continuous technical competition with Russian countermeasures. What the decoy adaptation revealed was the underlying strategic reality. Russia was now designing its operational doctrine around Sky Sentinel's existence. They were no longer treating Ukrainian air defense as a passive system to be overwhelmed by mass. They were treating it as an active, intelligent adversary with specific capabilities to be disrupted. That is a fundamental shift from a mathematical equation of drones versus missiles to a contest between competing sensor and data architectures. Unpopular opinion. Russia's Alabuga investment was strategically rational given what they knew in 2023. The assumption that high production volume would exhaust Ukrainian interceptor stocks was defensible analysis at the time. The failure was not in the production logic. The failure was in the intelligence assessment of Ukraine's capacity for rapid sensor integration and software adaptation. Russia's doctrine assumed a static defender. Ukraine built a learning system. That mismatch between doctrine and reality is the real story of the spring 2026 air campaign. The numbers from April and May 2026 that independent analysts compiled from Ukrainian Air Force daily reports and geolocated debris assessments showed the structural shift clearly. In corridors with full Sky Sentinel coverage and active Yak-52 intercept operations, Shahed neutralization rates were consistently above 85%. In corridors where coverage was degraded by jamming, terrain masking, or gaps in the ePPO civilian network, rates dropped towards 60%. The system's effectiveness was directly correlated to the density of its sensor coverage, and Russia was actively probing for the gaps. What would you do? Design your swarm to saturate the sensor network and burn through interceptor positioning resources, or accept the losses and concentrate remaining drones on the highest value targets? Tell us in the comments, because Russian operational planners faced exactly this choice, and the answer they chose shaped the next phase of the campaign. More retention caught point. Viewer question planted. The Patriot expenditure data tells the most direct story of Sky Sentinel's operational impact. Patriot PAC-3 missiles are one of the most consequential constraints on Ukrainian air defense capacity. The United States and allied nations provided batteries and interceptor stocks, but production and delivery timelines made replenishment slow relative to consumption rates. Every PAC-3 expended against a Shahed-class target was a missile that could not intercept a ballistic missile or a high-speed cruise missile. Russian swarm doctrine was designed to drive that consumption rate to unsustainable levels. Ukrainian Air Force officials, in briefings reported by Western defense journalists through March and April 2026, indicated that Patriot's role in the Shahed intercept mission had declined significantly compared to the previous year. The batteries remained fully operational and were being used heavily against ballistic threats, cruise missiles, and high-altitude air-launched weapons. Against the Shahed swarm specifically, Patriot was functioning as a final backstop rather than a primary interceptor, precisely the role it was designed for. The lower layers, made possible by Sky Sentinel's corridor prediction, were handling the high-volume, low-cost threats before they reached Patriot's engagement zone. Subscribe to Fury Military so you don't miss how Russia is trying to adapt its swarm doctrine, and why the structural advantages that Sky Sentinel created for Ukraine keep holding. The numbers that make this doctrinal, rather than tactical, are the cost ratios operating simultaneously across the intercept layers. At the top, Patriot PAC-3 at $4 million per interceptor, reserved for threats that justify the cost. In the middle, Iris TSLM engagements at approximately $500,000 per missile, handling medium-altitude cruise and ballistic threats. At the bottom, Yak-52 cannon intercepts at roughly $500 per engagement, handling the mass of the Shahed swarm. Sky Sentinel's function is to route the correct threat to the correct layer. Without the Fusion platform's corridor prediction, every layer would be fighting every threat. The cost economics only work when the routing is correct. Retention chant point. 16K Identity Tribal. This is what sensor-driven warfare looks like, and why mass alone no longer determines outcomes. Russia committed to a production strategy that generated genuine numerical advantage. 6,000 Jiran-2 drones per month is a real capability that stresses any air defense architecture. The strategy failed not because of the numbers, but because Ukraine built a system that converted Russia's mass into a predictable pattern. The more drones Russia launched along similar corridors at similar times, the more training data Sky Sentinel accumulated. The larger the swarm, the more acoustic signatures the sensor network detected. Russia's scale advantage became, in a specific technical sense, a liability. It made the system easier to predict. One detail that stuck with me when going through the OSINT documentation from this period: the ePPO civilian contributors, who became the most reliable inputs to Sky Sentinel's algorithm, were concentrated in small towns and villages in southern Ukraine that had been under regular Shahed attack since 2022. These were not trained observers. They were farmers, teachers, and shop owners who had learned over 4 years of war to recognize the sound of a Geron-2 engine from several kilometers away, and understood that their smartphone submission could redirect an interceptor. The most sophisticated AI-fused air defense system in the current conflict depends, at its civilian input layer, on people who simply refuse to stop paying attention. The doctrinal implications of Sky Sentinel extend well beyond Ukraine. Every major military with an air defense mission is studying this architecture. The question it poses for conventional doctrine is basic. When the primary tactical problem is high-volume, low-cost saturation attack, the correct response is not a higher-cost interceptor. It is a lower-cost interceptor guided by better prediction. The Fusion platform that enables prediction does not require expensive sensors or classified algorithms. It requires architecture, the correct connections between cheap sensor nodes, civilian data networks, and interceptors that cost less than the targets they engage. British defense analysis published through Janes and the Royal United Services Institute through early 2026 framed Sky Sentinel as a prototype for what future layered air defense architectures will look like regardless of geography. The system's core innovation, using passive acoustic sensors and civilian input to generate probabilistic corridor maps faster than a threat can traverse them, applies wherever the primary threat is subsonic, low altitude, and produced in quantity. That description fits an expanding range of potential adversaries and conflict scenarios globally. Russian mill bloggers covering the Alabuga production program began, by May 2026, to shift their framing. The language of inevitable victory through attrition gave way to analysis of why intercept rates were not declining as production increased. Some attributed it to Western sensor deliveries, others pointed to electronic warfare modifications. A smaller number engaged honestly with the structural problem that Ukraine had built a learning system and that the system was improving faster than Russian countermeasures were degrading it. That honest minority was correct. Retention can't point. Last 60s payoff plus open loop. The spring 2026 air campaign over southern Ukraine did not resolve the fundamental tension between Russian drone production capacity and Ukrainian air defense depth. Russia continued to launch. Ukraine continued to intercept. The economics remained contested, but the trajectory had shifted. Neutralization rates in covered corridors held above 85% through May. Patriot battery consumption on Shahed-class targets remained at reduced levels. Yak-52 intercept operations continued to expand, and Sky Sentinel's algorithm continued to be refined with each night of operational data. The question the system leaves open is the one every Air Force watching this conflict is asking. Can the architecture scale? Sky Sentinel works when sensor coverage is dense, when the ePPO network is active, and when the threat follows corridors that acoustic propagation can characterize. What happens when Russia deploys Shaheds with active noise suppression? What happens when launch corridors are randomized faster than the algorithm can adapt? What happens when the civilian contributor network is targeted by information operations designed to flood it with false reports? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the operational challenges that will define the next phase of this contest. Can AI-fused passive sensor networks maintain their prediction advantage against an adversary that has studied their architecture and is specifically designing countermeasures? Drop a comment with yes or no. We read everyone. For a closer look at how Ukraine's drone intercept doctrine evolved from 2022 to the Sky Sentinel architecture of 2026, and what the next generation of Shahed countermeasures may look like. The full analysis is in our next video. The purpose of this analysis is not to glorify war, but to understand the military and human realities behind it, because the clearer we see modern conflict, the clearer the value of deterrence, stability, and peace becomes.